So the next chapter in the textbook that we are going to cover is Chapter 7, which is all about organizing the body of your speech. The lecture following this will talk about the specifics of the intros and the conclusions, but this entire chapter is dedicated explicitly to just things you need to know about writing the body of your speech. So the very first and most important thing that you must do when you are writing the body of your speech, and this is something that will be directly affected by the general purpose of your speech, so that was to inform or to persuade, and the topic of your speech will be the organization of your speech. So there are 2, 4, 6, 7 different ways that you can write your speech to accomplish different goals. So depending on your goal, depending on your general purpose, your specific purpose, and your central idea, a lot of times that will lead to a recommendation as to which of the 7 organizational strategies you should employ to write your speech. So the first one is chronological. This one is very straightforward. It is where you do things in the order they occur. So a perfect example of speeches that you would use chronological for would be things like a demonstrative speech, where you're going to talk about how to make macaroni and cheese, and you go through the steps. First you boil water, then you add the shells to the boiling water, then you wait the allotted amount of time, then you mix in the butter and milk, and then you add the cheese. And because you're doing things in order, moving through time in a sequential order, that would be an example of when you'd want to use chronological. Another time is if you were giving a speech about an event that happened or the steps that led to something. So if you were giving a speech about what led to the Americans demanding that they be separated from the British and to become their own country, you might use chronological. So you would start at the beginning about no taxation without representation, then talk about the Boston Tea Party, then talk about the Quartering Act, and talk about how they were ignored, and then you lead up to the next event, and the next event that led to the American Revolutionary War. The second type of organizational strategy is topical. So this one is highlighting natural subtopics or divisions within a speech topic. So this is something that you would use a lot of times when it's this, and where you have a topic like the one I was kind of talking about when you visited the Minnesota Zoo and talking about the different animals there. So you have topics and then clear subtopics. So I would talk about the monkeys and then talk about the different type of monkeys, and then talk about the birds and then talk about the different types of birds. That would be a time that you would use topical. If you look at page 157 of your textbook, it gives you a great example of what the strategy is, when you might use it, and what types of speeches are most commonly used for it. So spatial, this one is one that I don't see used very often in my class, but it is one that I see used often out in the real world. So spatial is when you talk about things in relation to a central area. So if you were describing your house, so if you wanted somebody to go into your house to grab your car keys, which were on your bedside table, you would tell them, go in through the front door, walk through the living room straight, and when you get into the kitchen, you're going to take a right, which leads you into the bathroom, which then you go through the bathroom, and on the other side is your bedroom, or however your house makeup might be. But when you're giving them directions of those things. Or going back to the Minnesota Zoo, if you were giving a speech about your experience at the Minnesota Zoo, when you walked in the door, the first display out there was the monkey display. Then when you walked down the path a little ways, you went into the birdhouse. That might be another time that you use spatial. So that's when you talk about your entire speech centers around a starting point and where you went from there. Causal, which I always want to say casual, but it's not casual, it is causal, is the standard cause and effect. So this one is used most often in persuasive speeches. So the oil tanker turned over, spilling oil into the ocean. This caused the death of wildlife. So the cause was the oil tanker spilling over. The effect was death to wildlife, which is why we have to make sure that we have tankers that are more well suited to not spill if they tip over. So cause and effect is how you look at causal. Comparative, which is similar to that, is when you are comparing two things. So again, this one is most often used in persuasive speeches. So if you're arguing that you should use quilted northern toilet paper over cottonelle toilet paper, you're going to talk about all the things that quilted northern does that cottonelle doesn't do. And again, the next one is also, the next two are very, very similar. So you have problem solution, which again is most often used in persuasive speeches. And that is, we have a problem, the ozone layer is depleting, here's a solution, we need to get away from coal burning and look at other sustainable resources like hydroelectricity or solar paneling. So problem, solution. A more specific version of problem solution is Monroe's motivated sequence. This is very, very helpful when you're crafting a persuasive speech and you want to make sure you cover all of your bases. It is a 5-step strategy that motivates the audience into action based on their needs. So with Monroe's motivated sequence, the very first step is, just like when you're giving any speech, it's an attention. Grab the attention. So a lot of times you use a startling fact, for example. So 40,000 fish and wildlife were killed when the oil tanker tipped over and spilled oil into the ocean. Then you have to state a need. So what is this? So we need to figure out a way to stop this from happening so that we can save the lives of these innocent creatures. Then you need to have a satisfaction. So first is attention, then is need, then is satisfaction. Which that one is, what can you do to satisfy this need? What can we do to meet this need? So that would be, we need to come up with a stronger material to hold the tanker together that if it tips, it won't spill the oil into the ocean. Then visualization, so how would we go about that? So that might be when you bring out some statistics and some ideas about the different materials they should use. And then the action. So if you set the stage and cover all 4 of those steps, then the very last thing is you need to tell the audience what can they do to put your satisfying idea, so your conclusion, so your solution, what can they do to put that into action? Boycott the gas company until they look into this new material, or write the CEO every day and demand that they use something different. What is the action that you want the audience to take? I want to also note that the action does not have to be something physical that they do. It could be just to get them thinking about it. So I want you to think about what you do on a daily basis that could be injuring harmless animals. So it's not asking them to jump into action and do something, but to think about something, which is still a form of action. It does not necessarily have to be physical. So then the book talks about how to make a speech out of a strategy. So once you choose your strategy, so you choose chronological, then you have to use that to discover what your main points are going to be. So going back to that Minnesota Zoo example I had, if you use topical versus spatial, you're going to have 2 different speeches. So if I was to select the topical strategy for talking about my trip to the Minnesota Zoo, I'm going to talk about the animals I saw and what subtopics, so when I talk about the monkeys, what are the different types of monkeys, what do monkeys eat, what do monkeys do for entertainment. Then I'm going to talk about the birds. What are the different types of birds? What do they eat? What do they like to do for entertainment? And that's how I'm going to craft my entire speech. And then my third main point might be the penguins. What are their habitats like? How many are there? And how do we go about making their habitat? Versus if I was to use the spatial strategy, I would talk about when I walked in, what was the first thing I saw? The monkeys. Then I went down and I saw the birds. Then I went so it's going to change the way that you discover or introduce your main points. But once you have your strategy set, you can then use that to create your main points. A few tips for that. Remember to use complete sentences. Only one idea in each point. So I talked about that before. You can't cover penguins and monkeys in one point. They have to be different points. And only one idea in each subpoint too. So if I'm talking about monkeys, my first subpoint might be about their eating habits. My second main point might be about the different types of monkeys. My third main point will be about what they do to entertain themselves. That is acceptable. What would be unacceptable is if my first main point was the monkeys at the zoo. My first sub-point under monkeys was to cover what they eat and what they do for fun. Because now I'm covering two things in one sub-point that needs to be broken up. Be sure to use declarative sentences. So that means that you're not asking questions, you're not posing rhetorical ideas, you are not being vague in what you're talking about, you are being to the point and you are using full sentences. So the first exhibit I approached was the monkey exhibit. That is declarative. My subpoint I would not want it to say something along the lines of, I bet you're wondering what kind of food that they eat. That is not a declarative sentence. Instead, something along the lines of, monkeys eat a variety of food to sustain their daily activity. Now that leads me to go with a sub-point. The most common thing that they would eat would be fruits and vegetables that are provided to them by the zoo owners. And then maybe my second main point, their backup form of food sustenance would be things that they pull off of the trees and leaves and such and choose to eat that way. The next important strategy to keep in mind too is exactly what I was saying. So you create your main points, then you expand with subpoints. And then the book talks a little bit about things about having coordination, using parallelism. So this is again going back to making sure each one has a 2, each A has a B. Also making sure that if your first main point has 2 subpoints, then your second main point should also have 2 subpoints to make sure that you don't have one main point that's a page long and one main point that's 4 sentences long. You got to make sure that you keep those together. And then what parallelism was talking about is it can help if you start sentences in a similar way. It helps develop a rhythm. So first I went and saw, then I went and saw, the last thing I went and saw gives that kind of that rhythm to it and will assist in helping your audience navigate throughout your speech. So that is ideas about writing the body of your speech. Just a few final tips, and most of these I've covered. But make sure that all points must be balanced. So if there's a Roman numeral 1, there's a Roman numeral 2. If there's a 1, there's a 2. If there's an A, there's a B. And that always needs to be that way. You can have more than that. So you can have a 1, a 2, and a 3. But if the 1 has an A and a B, then the 2 needs an A and a B, and the 3 needs an A and a B. Each point and subpoint should only cover one piece of information. So that's why I talked about avoiding the ands. And the strategy you choose will affect how you write your speech. So make sure that if you're struggling with how to write your speech and you're struggling within the strategy that you're using, sometimes it might be easier to go back to the different types of organizational strategies and see if there's a different one that will fit better with how you want to go about writing your speech. So with that being said, that brings the lecture of Chapter 7 to an end. And the next lecture will be on Chapter 8, which is part of Tab 3, and that will be covering the nitty-gritty ins and outs of writing your introduction and conclusions, which will be at the beginning and end of your speeches with the body that we just went over how to create in the middle.